June 21st, 1942, Tobruk, Libya. The morning sun burned across the desert like molten gold, shimmering off the wreckage of British trucks and smoldering oil drums. Amid the haze of smoke and victory, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, stood atop a sand dune, binoculars pressed to his face. Below him, the shattered fortress of Tobruk had finally fallen. 35,000 Allied troops surrendered, and the desert echoed with the crackle of German radios reporting triumph. But this morning would bring something more than victory. As Rommel's men searched through the captured British headquarters, a dispatch rider rushed forward. In his hands, a battered metal case pulled from a half-buried jeep. Inside lay maps, supply manifests, and coded reports from General Auchinleck's command. Documents that shouldn't have been here at all. Rommel opened them himself. The paper was warm from the desert heat, smudged with grease and sweat. His pale blue eyes scanned the numbers, the lists of reinforcement, fuel convoys, and tank divisions building up under Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army. The reports spoke of hundreds of new Grant and Sherman tanks, convoys stretching from Alexandria to El Alamein, and a supply chain so vast it dwarfed anything the Axis could hope to match. For a moment, the desert wind howled through the open tent, lifting a page into the air, a single sheet that landed at Rommel's feet. He picked it up slowly. It detailed the arrival schedule of American fuel shipments. Endless reserves, infinite reach. Rommel didn't speak. He just stared out at the horizon, the same desert that had been his hunting ground for 2 years. For the first time, he saw not a battlefield, but a graveyard in waiting. He turned to his aide, Captain Lang, and said quietly, "If this is true, then we've already lost Africa." Outside, his troops cheered under the blazing sun, their flags waving over Tobruk's ruin. But inside that command tent, Rommel felt the chill of realization settling deep into his bones. Victory had come at a terrible price. The knowledge that it was his last true triumph. The Desert Fox had captured Tobruk, but in those very papers, he had also captured the truth of his own defeat.
The sun climbed higher, painting long shadows across Tobruk's shattered walls. Rommel stepped outside, his polished boots crunching on sand mixed with rubble. The smell of burning fuel and gunpowder still thick in the air. Around him, German soldiers celebrated, laughter and shouts filling the dusty street. But Rommel's mind was elsewhere, trapped in the grim numbers scrawled across those captured reports. He walked toward his command car, the wind carrying the distant roar of artillery from the approaching British reserves. Every map, every table of troop movements screamed the same truth. Montgomery's forces were not broken. They were growing stronger. Hundreds of tanks, armored cars, and artillery pieces awaited them just beyond the horizon, fully supplied and ready to strike. Inside the car, Rommel spread the papers across the dashboard. He traced the routes of incoming supply convoys with a calloused finger, feeling the weight of every ton of fuel, every crate of ammunition. The desert, which had once been his ally, now seemed endless, a vast stage for the inevitable clash he could no longer win. He recalled the earlier battles, Gazala, Bir Hakeim, victories hard fought and meticulously planned. And yet now, the scale of the British buildup made those victories feel fragile, almost meaningless. The numbers were staggering, each one a reminder that his forces were stretched impossibly thin. His tanks were fewer, his air cover sporadic, and his men exhausted from relentless marches under the merciless sun. Rommel's gaze drifted over the horizon. The dunes seemed to ripple like a living tide, a subtle reminder that time and logistics were on the enemy's side. Every grain of sand whispered the same warning: Africa slipping away. Turning to his trusted aide, Rommel's voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of both command and despair. "We cannot hold them, Lang. Our resources, our men, our tanks, it's not enough." The aide swallowed, understanding fully the gravity of the moment. In that instant, the jubilant celebrations outside contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in Rommel's mind. Victory had a bitter aftertaste. Tobruk had been captured, yes, but it had also unveiled the unstoppable tide that now advanced upon them. Rommel finally stood, letting the papers fall back onto the dashboard. The desert wind swept them, as if mocking the transient nature of triumph. He knew this moment would be remembered not for the glory of the capture, but for the dawning realization of inevitable defeat. The Desert Fox had won Tobruk, but the shadow of doom now stretched across Africa, longer,
and darker than ever before. The evening sun dipped low, casting long, jagged shadows across the dunes. Tobruk's walls, still scarred from artillery and flamethrowers, glowed orange, almost burning in the fading light. Rommel stood alone on a ridge overlooking the harbor, the cries of surrendering Allied soldiers echoing faintly below. Victory had a hollow ring tonight. The capture of Tobruk was complete, yet the taste of triumph was tinged with a sharp bitterness. He unfolded the final set of intelligence reports, detailing not just the numbers of Montgomery's Eighth Army, but their arrival schedules, supply lines, and artillery positions. Hundreds of trucks, fully stocked with rations and ammunition, were scheduled to arrive in the next weeks, along with dozens of Grant and Matilda tanks. The desert, which had been his ally, now seemed to betray him. Every ridge and dune a reminder of the overwhelming force soon to converge. Rommel's mind raced. He imagined the British tanks rolling across the sands, the rumble of engines like thunder announcing the turning tide. His own divisions were depleted from weeks of relentless combat. Fuel shortages, worn tracks, and tired men made even basic maneuvers risky. The desert, which once been a tool of surprise and strategy, was no longer a shield. In the dim light, he called a meeting with his senior officers. Maps were spread across sandbags, reports flapping in the evening breeze. Rommel's voice cut through the wind, calm but heavy with foreboding. "We've taken Tobruk, yes, but what lies ahead is beyond our capacity. The Eighth Army is not weak. It is overwhelming. Every move we make will be watched, every weakness exploited." A silence followed. Officers shifted uncomfortably, aware that the Desert Fox had rarely spoken with such stark clarity. The reality was inescapable. The capture of Tobruk was a fleeting victory, a brief pause before the storm. Rommel walked among his men, his eyes scanning faces lined with dust and fatigue. Each one carried the weight of the coming struggle, yet they trusted him, even as he himself wrestled with the truth. As night fell, the desert wind grew colder, whispering across the dunes. Rommel stood at the ridge once more, staring into the darkness, imagining the battles to come, the clashes at El Alamein, the relentless push of British armor, the impossibility of replenishing his stretched forces. For the first time, the Desert Fox realized that the sands he had once commanded were no longer his domain. Africa was slipping away, and no maneuver, no tactic could halt the tide now gathering beyond Tobruk. Night fully descended over Tobruk, the sky a black velvet stitched with distant stars. The desert seemed still, but Rommel knew better. The desert never truly slept. Somewhere beyond the dunes, British reconnaissance units were already moving, preparing to exploit the very intelligence he had uncovered. The same documents that had promised insight also revealed the inevitability of confrontation. Rommel returned to his tent, unrolling maps under the dim glow of a single lantern. Every marker, every line, every annotation reinforced a singular truth: the Axis hold in North Africa was no longer sustainable. He traced the routes Montgomery would likely use, imagining columns of tanks advancing across the sands, supply lines stretching like veins, pumping lifeblood to an unstoppable army. He thought of his own unit, exhausted, thinly spread, running low on fuel and ammunition. His generals, loyal and skilled, could only do so much with so little. For the first time, Rommel contemplated a retreat, not as a tactical maneuver, but as a strategic necessity. Pride battled with pragmatism in his mind, but history demanded clarity. Rommel spoke softly to his aide, almost as if confessing to the desert itself. "We cannot match them in resource, not here, not now. We must prepare for what comes next." The air inside the tent was heavy. The silence was punctuated by the distant crack of gunfire and the occasional rumble of truck, reminders that war never pauses, even when a city falls. This realization, more than any battlefield defeat, marked a turning point. Tobruk had been a victory, yes, but it had also revealed the limits of Axis ambition in Africa. He stepped outside again, the cold night wind carrying the scent of the sea from Tobruk's harbor. Stars glittered above, like indifferent witnesses to the unfolding drama. The Desert Fox had won the day, but the desert whispered a warning. The war for Africa was far from over, and soon the tide would turn irrevocably against him. In capturing Tobruk, Rommel had seized more than a city. He had grasped the magnitude of the storm approaching. the turning point from which there would be no easy victory. Dawn broke over the desert, pale and fragile, casting long shadows across Tobruk's battered streets. Rommel walked slowly among his troops, his uniform crisp but dust-streaked, his eyes scanning every face for signs of exhaustion or doubt. Around him, soldiers cleaned rifles, stacked ammunition, and tended to the wounded, the remnants of fierce combat. Victory had come at a cost, and every man felt it. Inside the command tent, Rommel's staff gathered for a briefing. Maps sprawled across tables, pins marking supply routes, tank divisions, and artillery placements. Rommel's gaze was sharp, calculating, but the weight of knowledge pressed upon him like the desert sun. He alone understood the implications of the documents captured at Tobruk. The Axis forces were overstretched, supplies were dwindling, and the Allies were amassing strength at an alarming pace. "We must consolidate our positions," Rommel instructed, his voice low but resolute. "Every movement, every deployment, will decide whether we hold or fall. Tobruk is only the beginning. The desert is vast, but the enemy is larger still." The officers nodded, some apprehensive, others resolute, but all aware of the grave reality. Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox had been forged through daring maneuvers and audacious strategies, yet even now he felt the strain of command. Every decision carried the weight of thousands of lives and the future of the Axis campaign in Africa. As the morning heat intensified, Rommel stepped outside once more, staring across the dunes toward the horizon. The desert wind lifted a plume of sand, whispering like a voice from the past, reminding him of battles won and lost, victories fleeting, and the relentless march of time. He closed his eyes for a moment, imagining the battles yet to come, the strategies he would employ, and the heavy burden of foresight. For Rommel, the capture of Tobruk was no longer just a military achievement. It had become a crucible of leadership, a moment where triumph and foreboding collided in the desert sands. By midday, the desert sun blazed overhead, relentless and unforgiving. Tobruk, now under German control, radiated heat from every stone and sand dune. Rommel rode along the edge of the city in his staff car, observing the operations of his engineers and logistics teams. Trucks moved in precise formations, supplies were counted, and prisoners were organized. Yet his mind was elsewhere, locked on the grim reality revealed in the captured intelligence. He thought of the Eighth Army gathering beyond the horizon. The reports had made it painfully clear Montgomery's forces were no ordinary enemy. Tanks, artillery, and endless supplies were arrayed in perfect coordination. Even with Tobruk as a foothold, the desert's vast expanse would soon work against him. Every maneuver would require not just courage, but cunning beyond what the desert had ever demanded. Rommel's aides noticed the shift in his demeanor. The confident swagger that had defined the Desert Fox was replaced by a measured, somber pace. He gathered his generals for a tactical session. Maps were spread across sandbags, red markers showing enemy positions, blue ones representing German units. Every calculation was tinged with urgency. "The desert does not forgive mistakes," Rommel said quietly, almost to himself. "It tests endurance, supply, and strategy. Tobruk is ours today, but tomorrow the sands will judge us."
The evening sky over Tobruk turned a deep, bruised purple, the sun dipping beneath the horizon as if hiding from the harsh realities of war. Rommel stood atop a dune, the wind tugging at his uniform, carrying the faint scent of salt from the harbor and the acrid smoke from distant skirmishes. In that quiet moment, the desert seemed to pause, as if offering a brief reprieve from the chaos of battle. Rommel's mind replayed the intelligence captured earlier, the meticulous organization of Montgomery's forces, the sheer volume of tanks, trucks, and supplies, and the efficiency with which the Allies could replenish and regroup. The scale of it was staggering. He could almost see the tanks rolling over the dunes, hear the engines rumbling like approaching thunder, smell the oil and dust stirred up by their advance. Inside the command tent, officers whispered among themselves, cautious not to break the silence of contemplation. Rommel traced supply lines with a finger, noting choke points and possible defensive positions. Each calculation revealed another uncomfortable truth. No matter how skillfully he deployed his forces, the Allies had the resources and momentum to dictate the coming battles. He turned to his aide, his voice heavy with resolve. "We have a few days to consolidate, to prepare, but the desert will decide, not our pride." As night fell, Rommel walked through Tobruk's captured streets, observing his soldiers. Their faces reflected exhaustion and fleeting satisfaction, unaware of the strategic storm approaching. The Desert Fox knew that Tobruk, glorious as its capture seemed, was merely a momentary triumph. The desert's vast expanse, combined with the relentless logistics of the Eighth Army, meant that every day forward would test them to their limits. Rommel had glimpsed the inevitable, a war not won by courage alone, but by supply, endurance, and the unforgiving nature of the desert itself. Tobruk had been captured, but the tide had already begun its inexorable turn.
Night had settled fully over Tobruk, the stars glittering coldly above the desert like distant, indifferent witnesses. Inside Rommel's command tent, maps glowed under the flicker of lantern light, dotted with pins marking positions of tanks, artillery, and supply convoys. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional clatter of boots on sand and the distant hum of engines. Rommel stood at the center, surrounded by his senior officers. His gaze was steady, voice calm, but filled with urgency. "We must prepare for what comes next. Montgomery will not rest. He will exploit every weakness, every delay. Tobruk is our foothold, yes, but the desert will not wait for us to catch up." He assigned patrols to scout the surrounding dunes, ordered engineers to reinforce supply lines, and directed artillery teams to position where they could best slow an enemy advance. Every decision carried weight, each plan a delicate balance between audacity and survival. Rommel knew that a single misstep could unravel everything: his men, his reputation, and the Axis campaign in Africa. As his officers departed to execute orders, Rommel lingered, staring at the maps. He could almost see Montgomery's tanks rolling across the dunes, the coordinated strikes of artillery and infantry testing every weakness. The desert was vast, but it had a voice, relentless, impartial, and exacting. Outside, the wind swept across Tobruk, lifting sand in thin, swirling streams. Rommel felt the weight of command heavier than ever before. The capture of Tobruk was a victory, but it had also exposed the precariousness of his position. Each day would now be a test of endurance, strategy, and resolve. The Desert Fox had won a city, but the storm gathering on the horizon would demand more than courage. It would demand mastery of every ounce of his leadership and the unforgiving desert itself. The first light of dawn spilled across Tobruk, painting the dunes in a harsh, unforgiving gold. Rommel walked along the perimeter of the city, boots sinking into sand heated by the early sun. The captured British fortifications loomed behind him, reminders of the fierce resistance overcome, but also of the immense effort required to hold the city. He paused, staring at the horizon where the desert stretched endlessly, a vast stage for the battles to come. Every grain of sand seemed to whisper a warning. The Eighth Army was gathering, and soon their tanks and troops would descend like an unstoppable wave. Rommel's mind replayed the intelligence once more: the supply convoys, the tank divisions, the artillery placements. And with each thought, the reality weighed heavier on his shoulders. In his tent, Rommel met with his aides. They discussed troop rotations, supply management, and defensive positions. Every plan was carefully measured, every decision shadowed by the knowledge of the enemy's overwhelming resources.
The desert fox, known for audacious maneuvers and bold attacks, now faced the sobering truth that no clever strategy could fully compensate for the imbalance in men, tanks, and fuel. He looked out again toward the dunes, imagining Montgomery's tanks rolling relentlessly forward. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, a symbol of leadership and resolve. But he knew that courage alone would not decide the coming battles. Tobruk had been captured, yes, but the scales of war were tipping, and the Axis forces were stretched dangerously thin. Rommel had faced many challenges, but the captured plans revealed a truth more daunting than any battlefield. The desert was no longer his ally. Africa itself seemed to conspire against him, and the desert fox knew that the real battle had only just begun.
The desert awoke with a golden glow, the first rays of sunlight glinting off sand and metal alike. Tobruk lay quiet, almost eerily so, the captured city now a staging ground for what Rommel knew would be a grueling struggle. Around him, German soldiers prepared for the coming days, tending to tanks, cleaning rifles, and fortifying positions. Each man moved with purpose, unaware that their triumph had already been overshadowed by the looming reality of Montgomery's reinforced army. Rommel stood atop a small ridge, surveying the horizon. The captured plans still weighed heavily in his mind. Each line a reminder that the Eighth Army was formidable, well supplied, and poised to strike. He could almost hear the rumble of engines before they even arrived, envisioning the massive columns of Grant and Matilda tanks advancing, artillery firing in deadly precision. The desert, once a landscape of opportunity, now loomed as an unforgiving adversary. Turning to his aides, Rommel's voice was calm but resolute. "We have Tobruk, but the desert will test us. We hold here not just for the city, but for the survival of our forces in Africa. Every decision, every movement matters. Prepare the men. The true battle begins now." Even as his orders were carried out, a quiet tension lingered in the air. The soldiers felt it instinctively, the awareness that their triumph was temporary, that the desert's vastness held challenges beyond imagination. Rommel himself felt the burden of foresight, knowing that Tobruk's capture marked both a high point and a turning point. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the dunes, the desert fox readied his forces. Tobruk was in German hands, but the desert whispered its warning. The sands of Africa would soon demand their ultimate reckoning.